Hello and welcome to the Proptech Hot Seat on iPropertyRadio with myself, Carol Tallon, the show where we explore trends and technologies driving innovation across the built environment. This show is brought to you in partnership with Proptech Ireland, the hub for innovators, investors and for industry leaders. In the Proptech Hot Seat today is Cillian Casey, VP of CIM. Cillian, you're very welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Carol. Thanks for having me. Great to be on.
I'm delighted. I think most people across real estate will be familiar with the CIM offering, but for anybody who isn't, you might just talk about the core offerings.
Yeah, sure. So I guess essentially CIM exists to be kind of a world leader in the building analytics software space. CIM software is called Peak Platform, and really what it does is it empowers kind of operational teams to work smarter and more collaboratively to kind of maximize operational and also energy efficiency across building portfolios. As a company, it was founded in 2014 in Australia by an Irish guy called Dave Walsh. We expanded up to Europe in 2019, not too long before COVID, so that was an interesting challenge. And in the last 12 months as well, we've been pushing into the US and kind of expanded there as well in the US. Our head office is in Sydney. We've probably got around 65 employees globally, of which we've got about 15 here in Ireland, kind of serving Europe. And then we've got a couple in the US, and we've got obviously the rest kind of sitting between Australia and New Zealand. I guess in terms of how CIM works or how Peak works, so Peak works by kind of automating kind of critical operational activities and helping with the completion of key tasks that are accelerated by kind of leveraging digital workflows and digital reporting across kind of the entire supply chain. And Peak has a vast library of fault detection and diagnostic algorithms that essentially continuously monitor all your building equipment to immediately identify any failures or any tuning and optimization opportunities, and also provide kind of a clear path or a clear guidance as to what you need to do to rectify it. That's a very long answer.
No, not at all. No, it's good for us to understand. And I suppose one of the things that I tried to do, because, a couple of years ago, we might be talking about the different data sources that would be within a building. And one of the things that really emerged was that our building management systems were, even in new buildings were implementing quite dated building management systems. So how does that work for you, say, in a building where you're coming in, because there's such a different level of technology employed, the age of the technology, trying to integrate your system there. And obviously most places would have a number of different types of technology. So maybe, first of all, are you operating for new buildings, retrofits, or just going into existing buildings? Is there any limitations?
No, there's no real limitations. From our end, we work across all, from brand new buildings that have maybe just got to project completion, and you might be in there for the I suppose the defects period, where you're trying to ensure that any issues with the operations of the plant and equipment is picked up during that time, so that when it does get to final completion, the operations team are taking ownership of a fully functional operational building without all those headaches and teething issues that you may typically get from a new project that has maybe been rushed to get that PC date. And then we're also then in the buildings that are 10 to 15 years old, that have kind of relatively modern BMS systems, where you touched on a moment ago, oftentimes there are, I suppose, the BMS system, it's been well documented, and I'm sure many people on your podcast have spoke about it, where it hasn't really evolved in quite a long time, from pneumatics to DDC, and then it pretty much stopped. But the buildings still are generating a lot of data all the time, but people just didn't know how to use it. It was kind of locked away in the black boxes, right? The more modern buildings, say 10, 15 years, it's quite easy to get in or to integrate with those once you've got the right tools to pull that data out. And where we play there is obviously extracting that data, normalizing that data, and then overlaying kind of the smart algorithms to pinpoint where the efficiencies can be derived from the existing data that's within those buildings. And that's really kind of changing how people operate buildings at that level, where you're kind of moving more from trying to manage what's in a BMS alarm console, which is never configured correctly, to more giving you insights in terms of this is where these opportunities are in your facility from a comfort perspective, where you may have potential temperature issues with your tenants that you want to stay ahead of, or a maintenance issue where you're talking about pieces of equipment that is, for example, chillers might be short cycling, coming on and off quite a bit. You wouldn't necessarily notice that looking at a BMS or looking at the zone conditions, but you'll notice it when your chiller stops working after 7-8 years and your maintenance bills go through the roof. So getting ahead of those and triggering alerts or workflows to ensure that people have that data at their fingertips. And then obviously the energy side of things, where you're talking about, okay, even LEED platinum buildings or whatever it may be that people have, they assume that they've got a well-run building just because they might have the best of equipment in there. But 9 times out of 10 or 95 times out of 100, they're not operating optimally. And people just assume because the kilowatt hour per square meter is lower than another building, that it's running well. But obviously there's a lot more you can do if you get those facilities running correctly and efficiently. And then I suppose the third point is the older buildings. There's still a lot to be done from buildings that have BMSs that are 15 to 20 to 25 years old. The biggest challenge there would be maybe the integration side of things, where you've got even more proprietary pieces of equipment. But there's various ways of getting data from those facilities, from installing devices that can speak different proprietary protocols, or even like plugging and pulling directly from the database and the likes, and getting that data up and pushing it into the cloud and normalizing it and kind of giving that value from there as well.
It's interesting to get the perspectives. I suppose maybe the different approaches needed given the age of the building. But I'm particularly interested when you talk about new builds and maybe coming in at defect stage. And tell me, how early into a project for a new build would you be consulted? Because I suppose I'm always curious about the digital infrastructure, and I would hold the belief that should be part of the planning process, that actually the digital infrastructure is not something that gets layered on top, which we know has happened in the past, but it's a much more expensive way to do it, and it's the least effective way, not to even look at cost efficiencies, but even in terms of delivering a good outcome. It's much better if this can be done at planning stage and project planning stage, but it still so rarely is. So when are you typically brought into projects for new builds?
From the new build perspective, we would be kind of brought in depending on if we've got existing customers, for example, that we've got a good relationship and we're on their portfolios. They would come to us and say, okay, this is the design that we're looking with our particular facility. Does this make sense from your end based on what you need to do with the data and how you add value to the data after that? And we would then do a review of the design and just say, look, this looks like it's maybe the vendor or the solution that's been proposed is not the most open from a data perspective. They may not be using industry standard protocols, which is becoming less typical, but still you'd be surprised some of the bigger vendors still try to put their own proprietary protocols with a backnet stamp or a LAN stamp on it, but kind of still proprietary in reality. So we would make recommendations and make comments on what's been proposed from an installation perspective. And then really we would then only get involved at the project completion stage, where we will then bring our software in, because obviously our software is there to help find where the opportunities are, but you can't bring that in before people have actually finished doing their install. So you need to give them time to come in, get all their data configured, get all the control algorithms set up, and then we'll come in afterwards and help them through that period to ensure that anything that may be rushed or not finished adequately during that period is triggered from a software perspective after
that. I think you've touched on a problem that is really only a known problem in the last number of years, and that is buildings are, even not very modern buildings, even those kind of 15, 20 years, they are generating data. So they are data rich, but maybe the portfolio managers are maybe insight poor, and that's a real problem. So how does the technology help to translate that and turn that around? Previously we would have had to make the business case for unlocking insights from this data, whereas now we can see, it's very much driven by regulation, by funding requirements, by new ESG reporting. So how does the technology help the portfolio owners here and managers?
Yeah, I guess from our end, our technology, there's no kind of capital outlay required. So there's no upfront cost. We don't install any additional hardware. We don't install devices. I think historically and even now, there are companies that will come in and install loads of sub-metering and pull that data out, or install loads of additional sensors and do that. Where we focus on is using, as you touched on, what's existing in the facility, where there are typically hundreds of thousands of data points every day kind of streaming around in the building, but no one is actually getting any value out of that. So how we firstly get that data is we've got a data acquisition device that can go in, sit on a building network, talk all those various protocols and languages, and pull them up and send it up into the cloud. And then from a use case, you're exactly right. You've got the typical stuff where you're looking at just reducing energy, which can go towards reporting and net zero targets, to the people and the comfort and the maintenance and all that. But more recently, we're having customers that are talking to us around green leasing or green financing and the likes as well, where they're signing into large financial loans from a green perspective, and they then need to commit to improving their sustainable performance of their facilities, and the interest rates then are kind of linked to that. So what our software can help them in that instance is kind of create that hopper of opportunities to reduce the energy consumption and show them what they need to do to help drive that drop in energy consumption or carbon emissions, but also help them report on that by pulling the data from, you mentioned different kind of systems. So you might have, obviously, in the HVAC world or the BMS world, 30, 40, 50, 60% of your energy consumption going there. But we'll also then integrate with like an EMS system if that's on site, or pull data directly from the utility provider, which you're also getting your energy bills on, so that you can then correlate your ups and downs on your energy bill on the software and have that dashboarded versus the actions and the work that's happening on site to improve it, and bringing that all together from a reporting perspective, and then pushing that up the lines, which can then feed into the, either your GRESB reporting or, your financial reporting or whatever you need to do as well. So it's kind of mixing the different data sources with mixing the old fashioned operational buildings world with the finance world, which is becoming more and more relevant and prevalent, I guess.
Is there a geographical difference there? Because what you're describing there are essentially all drivers, but maybe for slightly different reasons. And the fact that CIM had its origins, albeit from an Irish base, had its origins in Australia, then into Europe, and now into the US. Are the drivers different in those different regions?
Yes, they are. I mean, you mentioned Australia. Now, I think Australia, it's well known, Australia is a world leader in the building technology space, and many companies come out of Australia there. It's also a world leader from a buildings perspective in the sustainability space, where Australian REITs are always kind of number one in the GRESB kind of ratings as well. And also in Australia as well, they've got neighbours, which I'm sure you're aware of as well, which essentially means that any commercial office in Australia needs to publish its operational energy consumption every year, and they need to get recertified every year. And if a commercial office is over 1,000 square meters, it needs to have that. And what that's done is it's then driven from an end user perspective, where initially government agencies were coming in saying, we can't lease a facility less than 4 stars neighbours or whatever it may be. Now it's up to 5.5, I think it is. But then obviously tenants are coming in, the larger companies, saying we want a high neighbours rating, or we want a minimum of X, Y, and Z. So my thumb went up. And now it's become, I think over Australia in 15 years, it went from say 2 stars up to an average of 5 stars across the board in different real estate investment trusts. And it's been driven, off the demand from the tenants, but then also there's kind of a valuation on the property, because if your neighbours ratings are low, you can't get the tenants in. Obviously, commercial office is driven on full buildings on long leases. The valuation so it goes up that way. In the UK, when we moved up here, we found that there was no real driver like that. There was no in operation energy or operational or energy or kind of optimization targets put in place. So there was no real demand from the market to reduce energy, aside from the likes of your EPC ratings and your MEES, which aren't in operation. They're more based on the design. So then the use case there, is obviously slightly different. And the US was quite similar as well up until recently now, where the likes of New York and some other states are putting in some pretty large carbon penalties. If you go above a certain level, then you get, pretty $250 per ton. I can't remember the exact numbers on it. I must look that up. I had it in my head recently. But essentially, they're getting penalized for not performing from an energy perspective, which makes the business case for our solution more valuable again. And then on top of that, the tenant side of things is critical as well. So we put a lot of focus on our software, giving visibility on indoor environment and ensuring that your tenants are happy so that they sign up to longer leases, etc. as well.
Cillian, I hope this isn't an unfair question, but would you have a view on, say, the different certifications that are available globally now? Because, obviously we've seen over the last 6 or 7 years this proliferation of global certifications. And I think, what tends to happen in the industry is people lean towards one or the other. Would you have a view of those, or, what's your position?
I would, and I may be kind of slanted because I spent 8 years in Australia and I've seen the kind of evolution of neighbours, and how important it is to have an in operation actual measurement. And so for me, neighbours is probably the best energy rating tool in on the market. The UK started to bring it in with Neighbours UK, but I think it seems to be a bit in limbo at the moment. So BRE were kind of the body that were kind of administering Neighbours UK in the UK, but they've since stepped away. So that's kind of in no man's land at the moment. So for me, having something in operation, whatever that may be, is important. And then the second big challenge we have, and you kind of touched on it there are various different rating tools out there. There's no standardization, there's no standard approach, so there's no way to benchmark across, even in countries, never mind say across Europe or across the USA or across the world. And again, from a neighbour's perspective, it's standard. You can actually compare apples with apples across the board. In other regions, they talk about they might have BREEAM or they might have LEED, or they're looking at well from a wellness perspective, but they're all measuring different things in different ways. So you can kind of, from a property perspective, pick the one that suits you the best and shines you in the best light, but you're not then able to compare how your properties are performing against others from an operational perspective. So the most important thing for me is really kind of the standardization approach, and then a model that they have from a neighbour's perspective, which is giving clear kind of it's very transparent in terms of how facilities are operating and allow you to kind of benchmark across the board. Because again, the EPC stuff for me isn't really worth much. I think I've read a paper as well recently where you've have EPC buildings that are, say, B rated or A rated, and their energy consumption per meter squared is aligned with what's an E building, because there's no correlation between what's actually installed from an equipment perspective to how well they're actually performing or how well they're using that equipment.
Do you think that's maybe feeding into some of the criticism that the real estate sector in particular has gotten in terms of greenwashing? And sometimes I think the criticism is a little bit unfair, because this is quite a new area, and I think people are genuinely trying to tackle it. But sometimes actually I can see where the criticism is coming from, but I think in the main, portfolio owners are absolutely trying to do the right thing. But you're right, this lack of standardization means that people are picking and choosing the credential they want to show, and that's not great, actually, not only from a reporting point of view, but actually for the end outcome, which is more efficiently operating building.
Absolutely, and we've got even customers, and again, we have customers in Australia, for example, that may have then they have Neighbours Energy, which is the one that you need to publish, but there's different tools, rating tools, that maybe you don't need to publish, and they would have went and got their certification, not scored all that well in it, so then didn't publish it and put it away, right? So you're only going to show what's good for you or what's going to benefit you. So from that end, the greenwashing side, that's not greenwashing, but that's an example of if you can just, you can kind of test the water first. If you're going to be shown in a good light, then I'll show it. If not, I won't, because I'm not been forced to kind of disclose it. The greenwashing thing, I've spoken to people at certain levels in up at this neck of the woods in terms of how they can hit their net zero targets, and there's still a bit of a thought process that, we'll get as far as we can with the optimization, but look, we can just procure green energy at the end of the day and we'll still hit our net zero targets, and we're really only going to focus initially on degasifying so we can bring in electrics and then try and buy green energy. But I guess there's only so much of that as well available on the market, so everyone can't take that approach. So again, most of our customers that we're working with are very much aware that the first step on their net zero journey is to cut and try and get as much as they can out of what they have, and then maybe look at the next step of maybe on-site generation to see what they can do with solar and wind or whatever it may be. And then really the last step should be kind of under procuring green energy as opposed to the first step, which a lot of people are kind of jumping onto that bandwagon, I think. And again, there could be reasons why people do that. Sometimes organizations take a very aggressive target and a very short timeline, and the only answer to that would be maybe to procure green energy, which is good, but you're still wasting a lot of energy, even if it is from a green source.
Yeah, it's interesting. Over the last decade, or particularly over the last maybe 6 or 7 years, charting a company's journey to net zero, it's amazing how things have changed, because 6-7 years ago it was absolutely acceptable to use carbon offsetting. In fact, that's how most people were setting out to achieve their targets. And recently I was doing an interview within the last year, and carbon offsetting was described to me like smoking in a doorway. It's antisocial, that basically, yes, you're complying, but only barely. And you're doing it in a way that is harmful to other people. And, while it seemed like a bold analogy, it did stick with me. And, you can see that as companies are making their journey to net zero, maybe what was acceptable 6 and 7 years ago isn't now, which makes me think what's acceptable today is maybe not what we want to be doing in 5, 6, 7 years' time. So I suppose when you're sitting down to speak to portfolio owners and managers, particularly in Ireland, what's their driving ambition? Like, is it to reduce their energy bills? Like, are they looking to see what the business case is? What's the actual return on investment here? Or are they looking at this from reporting and compliance?
Particularly in Ireland and the UK, where the buildings and the configuration of buildings is much different to Australia and even in the US. I think the biggest driver here would be the reporting and the compliance perspective, because oftentimes the owners are saying, well, our tenants kind of manage all their own equipment, they pay for all their own energy. So a lot of the initiatives you have, maybe we don't pay for that anyway, so it's not really hurting our bottom line. I think so. They were saying, but what we do have is we've got our own scope 1 and scope 2 targets, and then they may talk about their tenants being their scope 3 targets, but they're saying that they're focused on scope 1 and 2 initially. The other side of things, sorry, I lost my train of thought there on that.
No, you're fine. But actually, well, I think even that's interesting in itself. So, and to be honest, I suspected as much, and that's why I wanted to know when you're sitting down with people, because in a way that's slightly tokenistic, but is it right to view that as tokenistic, or is that just a natural stage? Is that just a natural part of the journey?
I think so. I think that's exactly what it is. And like it's really just, there needs to be an overarching driver that gets people to act, and a lot of the time in our industry, rightly or wrongly, that needs to be kind of financially driven, right? But if people, it needs to be driven by the net zero targets and
Yeah, no, but I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head. You just need to get people to act, and that's the really important point. So I suppose kind of as a final takeaway for today, Cillian, like what is your call to action for portfolio owners, particularly across Ireland and the UK? Like, what's the most important message that they need to know to be able to take the next right step for them?
For me, it's to understand exactly what you currently have in your portfolio, how they're operating, instead of trying to get to the finish line and try to solve the problem without actually understanding what the problem is. So, going into, you might have a portfolio of 25 buildings, understand how they're operating, understand what you need to do in each one of those facilities to get the consumption down as low as it needs to be, get the carbon emissions out of that building as low as it needs to be with what you already have, then make smart decisions from a capital perspective, then based on understanding from a data perspective what each piece of equipment is doing on each asset. Because again, you can't just go in, you don't have a bottomless pit of money to go in and upgrade everything at once. So then if you can do it smarter, you can cut as much as you can with the older equipment and then replace stuff that you can't get the actual the bang for the buck out of. So really the call to action is to get a view on what you already have in your stock and cut as much as you can with your existing stock, and then make smarter decisions around kind of upgrading your equipment moving forward off the back of that. And yeah, that's essentially it.
Yep, super. That's a great place to start. And look, I'd also recommend for people just to take a look at cim.io for some further information, or reach out to Cillian or any of the team there in Ireland. So that was Cillian Casey, VP of CIM. Our thanks as always to producer Katie Talon and to the audio team at Hear Me Roar Media. Before we go, just a special word of thanks to our sponsor, Proptech Ireland, for supporting the podcast and making these conversations possible. And thank you indeed for tuning in. We'll catch you on the next episode of the Proptech Hot Seat. In the meantime, please be sure to check out all of the other Irish and international real estate and construction shows on iPropertyRadio.com.